Someone said, "This is a difficult to swallow chicken soup movie, but when you finish reading it, you'll find this bowl of chicken soup not only melts on the palate, it can also give you a lot of motivation." The film is adapted based on real events. Chris used to have some success too, although life may not be particularly wealthy, but the family is harmonious. Until one misjudgment, he gave everything he could, hoarded a large amount of medical equipment, and this device is just a portable bone density scanner. He's just a little more accurate than X-ray imaging. But the price has doubled. Chris runs around every day. At least 2 units need to be sold in a month to make a living, but the high price has caused him to repeatedly encounter obstacles. The whole family's life has since plummeted to the bottom. My wife also has to work twice a day as a result, subsidizing household expenses. My lovely son can only transfer to the worst kindergarten. However, his sales still haven't improved. The daily necessities of daily life. It also increases the conflict between the couple, until one day, he asked 2 questions to a social elite driving a red sports car. When I learned that the man was a stockbroker, Chris sincerely envies and admires the man in front of him. He looked at everyone who came out of the building, with a relaxed and happy smile on his face. This scene kept Chris awake for a long time. The next day, he told his wife that he wanted to apply for a stockbroker, but his wife disdainfully asked him not to waste his time. "Why don't we find a way to sell all the instruments first? Solve the current dilemma." Chris did not give up the idea of becoming a stockbroker due to his wife's suggestion. The next day, he mustered the courage to apply for a job at a securities company, to make oneself more dignified. He handed over the equipment to a street singer, temporary storage for a few minutes, and paid $1 as compensation. However, he just received an internship application form from the personnel department. I suddenly realized that the wandering singer had left with his equipment. That's half a month's living expenses for him. Chris doesn't care about work either. Rushed downstairs immediately, chasing desperately, watching the wandering singer on the subway. But there's nothing I can do about it. He hates himself for being foolish like a silly hat. On the subway home, he just read it carefully once. Applied to understand this internship position. Only recruited 20 people within 6 months. And in the end, only one person can become a full-time employee. The educational requirements on the application form make it even more difficult for him to start. So he decided to break free from convention. I directly found the HR manager to promote myself. But the HR manager doesn't have time to talk to him at all. But Chris didn't give up on it. But I come to the securities company every day, waiting for the HR manager to pretend to run into the manager and be busy going elsewhere. Chris lead that he was on his way. He seizes every second to promote himself. However, the HR manager only focused on playing with the magic cube in his hand. But he couldn't recover, saying it's just a scam. Chris changed his mindset in a timely manner. Cater to one's preferences. Say you can restore it yourself. He took the Rubik's Cube, while explaining the principles behind it. One side began to rotate rapidly. Also asked the driver to drive slower. Unexpectedly, Chris arrived at his destination before really restored the Rubik's Cube. The HR manager looked at Chris incredulously. This may be the first time he has looked at the man in front of him with a straight eye. Chris doesn't know. It is precisely this accidental performance, bringing him new opportunities. But the manager didn't pay. When he got off the car, watching the constantly beating numbers, he felt uneasy inside, because he only has less than 10 yuan in his wallet. So while waiting for a traffic light, he chose to evade the bill. "Sorry." 3 words. Perhaps it was the last stubbornness in his mouth. Finally, he rushed into the subway station. "Stay." He ran into the subway at the last moment, just to avoid the driver's pursuit. But as a result, I lost one of my instruments again. Chris growled in frustration in the carriage. In the eyes of others, he's like a ridiculous clown. However, when he returned home in a state of confusion, I realized it was empty. His wife couldn't bear this kind of life. I chose to leave without saying goodbye. At this moment, his heart seemed to be hollowed out, a feeling of powerlessness, full body. At this point, he suddenly sounded. I thought it was my wife calling, but I didn't expect the HR manager to give him an interview opportunity. At this point, he has already released his son's house, unable to calm down for a long time, since we cannot retain our determined wife. But he must take his son. His house. This is not just a father's responsibility, it's also a love that I can't give up on my wife. At dinner time, there was a hurried knock outside the door again, and the rent they owe. The landlord couldn't bear it anymore. Let them move out immediately. Chris pleaded bitterly. Just gave the landlord an urgent grace of 1 week. However, the cost is that Chris will be responsible for repainting the house, and his bell rang again. This time the police knocked on the door, because they didn't pay the parking ticket. The landlord brought him back to the police station. Require him to settle at once. Full fine. Chris can only cooperate and sign a check. But the police still don't let him go home, because of concerns about his check being invalid, so we need to detain him. Confirmed by 9:30 the next day. But Chris has an interview the next day at 10 o'clock, and the son who is alone at home has no one to take care of. Despite explaining everything to the police, it won't change the outcome either. Under helplessness, Chris can only call his wife, requesting him to pick up his son from kindergarten, and take care of it all night. Early the next morning, Chris was finally released, but he didn't have time to go home and change his clothes. I can only run to the company wearing clothes covered in paint. Among many interviewees, he was uneasy, because this is his dream. It's also the only chance at the moment that could change his fate. The results can be imagined. Several interviewers saw him dressed like this. Their attitude is also very cold. Chris can only save himself, take the lead in breaking the deadlock. He explained that he had always wanted to invent a credible reason, but in the end, he still chose honesty. Chris confessed to the predicament he had encountered the day before. Indeed, it sparked a hint of interest among the company's boss, and the HR manager on the side also helped Chris put in a good word. Although I haven't seen it a few times, but in his eyes, Chris is a persistent and somewhat intelligent man. But the boss still gave him the last challenge. I'm not. I shouldn't. Chris' humorous answer with high emotional intelligence moved the interviewer, successfully obtained his internship qualification. However, at this moment, but he hesitated, because until now, he only realized that there was no salary during the 6 months of his internship. He began to doubt, is it worth the 1/20th chance? And if he doesn't give a response tonight, opportunity will be left to others. At night, Chris finally waited for his wife to deliver his son, but his wife told him he was going to work in New York. Although I couldn't bear to part with my son, but for a better life, he had to choose to leave. Wife. After leaving, he looked at his son sleeping soundly in bed. Silence for a long time. Finally, I called the company, received training invitation. After a week, Chris started a new life with his son. They moved to a motel with lower rent. It's time for a rare parent-child relationship. My son patted basketball and said he wants to become a basketball star when he grows up. Chris deliberately hit his son. Say, he's not made of this material. My son was indeed disheartened and put away his basketball to go home. At this point, Chris finally told his son heavily, make your own dream. Very interesting. Chris' words seem to be educating his son. Actually, it's also giving oneself a boost. He wants to encourage himself to become the person he expects in his heart. The father and son can only rely on those few instruments for their livelihood. However, internship life is not easy. The manager in charge of internship training often asks Chris to run errands for himself, but he never willing to waste any other time. He hardly put down the receiver, make direct calls between each call. Even the time for drinking water and going to the bathroom is saved. He wants to complete someone else's 9-hour work in 6 hours. Chris' persistent efforts, and finally won an opportunity to meet a client, but he needs to arrive within 20 minutes. But at this moment, the training manager asked him to help move the car. Then he rushed to the appointment location in 1 step and 2 steps. But it's still because I was a few minutes late and didn't see the client. So he took his son directly to the client's house on the weekend. Apologized for being late that day. Coincidentally, the client is preparing to watch the ball. Just invite him together. After the game is over, he also made more potential customers as a result. From then on, Chris' life has gradually improved. All the instruments in hand have been sold out. But life always sneaks a punch at you. This punch was so caught off guard. Due to Chris not paying taxes for a long time, the money saved by selling the instruments, directly deducted by the bank, and without any prior warning, now he only has $21 left in his card, which led to the bankruptcy of Ziofu, which he had finally managed. Once again, he is sitting in the park, lost in thought, helpless. But I accidentally saw an instrument that I had lost before, in the hands of a homeless man. He didn't say a word. Take it directly from the homeless man's hands. Right. Our hearts. Love his body. On the subway, she carefully scrubbed the instrument. This is for him. But half a month's living expenses. I finally found a buyer, but there was a malfunction during the testing. Fortunately, the doctor agreed to take it back after he fixed it. At this point, he can only say thank you words. There is no other way. But when he brought his son back to the hotel, I found that my luggage was packed by the landlord and left at the door. That's right, because he owed his rent. Being kicked out by the landlord. My son doesn't understand why the landlord is doing this. He wants to knock the door open. Chris had no choice but to leave with his son. They're sitting on benches in the subway station. I don't know where to meet you. My son is unhappy. Chris pointed to the instrument and said, that's a time machine. Just press the button to go back to the past. He asked his son where he wanted to go back. I'm just saying. Next. He asked his son to close his eyes. When it opens again, Chris was surprised and told his son, the first one is that my hands can. Sometimes it's. My son also cooperated very well and started playing with him. To avoid dinosaurs, Chris treats the bathroom like a cave. I took my son and hid inside, and locked the door back. He spread toilet paper on the ground, let his son fall asleep in his arms. At this moment, someone outside knocked on the door and wanted to come in. Chris is blocking the door. While, cover your son's ears. This is full of hope. A man who has been tormented by life to the point of exhaustion. Finally unable to suppress my inner emotions, crying bitterly. The next day, he can only take his son to live in a homeless shelter, to fight for the last bed of the day. Chris even had one time with others. Final. Someone reported another person cutting in the queue. He was able to live in, but life will be even more difficult afterwards. He brings his luggage to work every day. I have to pick up my son as soon as possible after work. Arrange beds at the shelter again. He is physically and mentally exhausted, and only when he attends church services, only then can we obtain a moment of tranquility. Soon the final exam for the intern arrived. Chris, in order to get in line, I finished the exam quickly. The result is downstairs. But I met the boss who took a taxi without a wallet. I want to borrow $5 from him. He flicked through his wallet, lent the boss the only $5 he had, and as a result he didn't have the money to ride the car. I haven't booked a bed for today either. Father and son standing in the crowd. but I don't know where to go. Final. He came to the hospital to donate blood, in exchange for $24. One day later, my son lent it to the boss at the shelter, and so on. You. The dad, a simple sentence, instantly cured Chris of all his fatigue and heartbreak. Night. He relied on the hallway lights, finally repaired with the purchased parts. Instrument. The lights illuminated the night, also shining a glimmer of hope into Chris' dark life. This instrument ultimately paid for the next month's living expenses. He brought his son back to the hotel, finally able to sleep comfortably. On the last day of the internship, the company leader called him into the office. Obviously, he's very nervous inside, but he also pretends to be calm. Funny to say. What do I need to ask? It's also this moment. Chris has rosy eyes. He worked hard through his own efforts, finally obtained the opportunity to become a regular employee. He tried his best to restrain his inner excitement, shake hands with every leader. Before leaving, the boss stopped him again. Then he confidently and calmly walked out of the office. Going out of the company, come to the street, he can no longer control his inner emotions, continuously applauding oneself in the crowd. Actually, the path of life is to move forward bravely, rely on one's own dreams and beliefs, diligence and persistence. Only then will there be a chance. Prove oneself and find the dignity you want in the pursuit process.